Good afternoon to you all. My name is Konstantin EGGERT, and this panel will be conducted mostly in English, with two participants speaking Russian, so I already commend our great interpreters for helping us on that. Two members of the panel will join us a bit later, but for now I have the pleasure and the honor to introduce Věra JOUROVÁ, the Vice President of the European Commission. Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a real special moment for me to be here with you and see so many Russians who share our common European values, which are peace, democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. We are together in the struggle to end Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and in the struggle for democracy in Russia. These struggles go to a large extent hand in hand, because freedom and democracy are strong deterrents to war, and especially to a war of aggression. I am optimistic about both these struggles. First, the European Union will stand by and support Ukraine for as long as it takes. And freedom, democracy, and the rule of law will find their way also to Russia. I believe in it. Sadly, I have to speak about peace in Ukraine and democracy in Russia in the future tense. However, the future is in the title of this roundtable, I think, the day after. Yes. So, I agree, we need to discuss the future and prepare for it. However, the future as such is abstract. So to prepare in concrete terms for the future, we must start with what we do now in the present. The EU will continue its support to Russian civil society, independent media, human rights defenders and NGO activists, regardless of where they are and whether they are inside or outside Russia. This support is not new. It has been a priority for us since before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Supporting democracy, peace and respect for human rights is a part of Union's DNA. A democratic Russia at peace with itself and its neighbours is in the interest of the EU, as much as it is in the interest of the Russian people. For a democracy to function, the right to vote, to be elected, and a fair competition play a central role. I regret to say that Russians cannot vote in free and fair elections. We want a broader cooperation with Russian civil society. We support human rights defenders and NGOs activists, people-to-people exchanges and public diplomacy activities. We do this not only to help continue your work, but also to strengthen our relations with those Russians inside and outside Russia who share our values. I also want to use this opportunity to congratulate you with some of your achievements. Russian activists have condemned Russia's war of aggression, Russia against Ukraine, against violence, atrocities, against the attack on Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian sovereignty. We applaud Russian anti-war forces when they unite against Russia's war and against imperialism. We know that you represent different groups with different political viewpoints and different leaders. We hear you when you speak up together in support of Ukraine's sovereignty and for democracy in your own country. Russian lawyers continue to defend the victims of politically motivated persecution of Russians who stand up against the war, for freedom and democracy and for accountability when the war is over. I want to say a special thank to you, thank you for the young Russians who have so clearly spoken out against the war. I see you, many of you here today. Many of you have been forced to leave your country, your families, and your studies. You have seen repressions, often violence, from the side of your country's authorities. Our hopes are with you and with your passion for democracy. We support your fight for your freedom and for your future. Russian independent journalists have been behind major journalistic investigations, including into war crimes and atrocities committed by Russian forces in Ukraine. Russian journalism, represented by Novaya Gazeta and its editor Dmitry Muratov, who I think is here today.
He was via satellite link.
Okay, I missed him. Has been recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize. Russian independent media are playing an essential role to inform Russian people about the reality of the war and to fight Kremlin's war propaganda. And I come from Czech Republic. I was born in Czechoslovakia, and I still remember my parents who were gathering around our radio to search and listen to Radio Free Europe or Voice of America. This is a vivid memory of my life under communist Czechoslovakia, and I remember the power of the media. That's why I came with the initiative which I called Radio Free Russia. Because many Russian journalists are today working in exile here in the European Union. And I had the opportunity to discuss with several of them. Some are also here in this room. We met in Riga, Prague, Amsterdam, Berlin. The European Union is doing more to support Russian independent media. But we have to do much more to provide funding, residence permits, legal, technical, and psychological assistance. This is an important project for me that I called, as I said to you, Radio Free Russia. This is not about establishing a new radio or media outlets, but working together to bring the truth to more Russian people. Another Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to Memorial, one of Russia's oldest NGOs whose name is known all over the world for protection of human rights and the history of political repression. And Memorial, according to my knowledge, is also
present here. Yes.
Present here. Thank you. Thank you for coming. The Sakharov Prize is awarded by this parliament in memory of the famous Russian dissident Andrei Sakharov. In 2020, it recognized the democratic opposition in Belarus. In 2021, Alexei Navalny, and in 2022, the Ukrainian people. I want to honor the political prisoners in Russia, leaders such as Vladimir Kara-Murza, Alexei Navalny, Ilya Yashin, and unfortunately many others. I wish them and their families much strength. And I see Madam Yevgenia Kara-Murza here today. Very nice to meet you. I spent yesterday evening with you and your husband on YouTube. I was listening to his speeches, his explanation also why the situation developed as it did. He spoke about the appeasement of the West. He spoke about the underestimation of what Putin can do. And I have to say, I never shared these views. I always understood what Putin is able to, because my first memory in my life was the Soviet Union tank in my street in Czechoslovakia. So I think that now we know much more in Europe. And thanks to you, thanks to your husband, we can have better insight in how to understand the situation and how also to understand the mentality of the enemy. Thank you, Madam Yevgenia, and thank you for what you said, that you are now the voice of your husband. It's a great honor. We are here in the house of the European Parliament. I always say that this is the Church of European democracy. So I want to thank the honorable members of the Parliament, Mr. Kubilius, Mr. Timoshevich, Mr. Guetta, Mr. Lagodinsky, for organizing this round table. I think I speak too long, so maybe a few words. I warn you, it can be very, very long. No, on behalf of the European Commission, I want to give you my strong assurance that we will continue not only support to Ukraine, but also the fight against the Russian disinformation and pro-Kremlin propaganda, which is on my table as the issue. And also, I promise that we will continue supporting the Russian journalists, the Russian human rights defenders, NGOs, and all the courageous people who are raising their voice and who are visible, speaking against Putin's regime. still being aware that they undertake horrible, horrible life risks. And so I want to thank all of you for this effort. I know that today you will be discussing the future of democracy in Russia. For me, this is a big question mark. I never know what to answer. I've been asked about that many times by the journalists, especially by the journalists from Western countries, because they know I come from the Eastern Bloc and that I might have some better insight. And I would really like to understand this better. I don't have courage to say any opinion. You will maybe hear many different opinions here, but I would like to understand after your discussion here how you yourself see the chance of seeing democratic Russia and seeing the Russian people living in peace, democracy, enjoying the rule of law principle, enjoying independent judges, enjoying freedom of speech, enjoying free media. I would really love this, to see this for the Russian people, because I believe they deserve it. Many, many of them who do not support Putin's regime, but also those who have been, sorry to say it, brainwashed by Putin's propaganda. And I believe that we can do much more to bring them back. Thank you very much, and good luck in whatever you are doing. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Madam Vice President. Without further ado, we'll start with the panel. I think we'll probably have to ask later Kirill and Piotr Wagner to move onto stage, because we don't have enough places here, but I promise to shift. Another promise I'll try to keep is to make this panel as dynamic as possible. And if we manage to distract you from your smartphones for at least half of the time, then we'll think that the panel was successful. I will very briefly introduce those who have a great pleasure and the honor with me on the panel, to have with me on the panel. It's Vladimir MILOV, who is Vice President of the Free Russia Foundation, Dmitry GUDKOV, former member of the Duma, Sergey PARKHOMENKO, who is a journalist and political commentator, and Kirill ROGOV, who is a political analyst. He'll join us a bit later. Plus, we have John HERBST, who is a former US ambassador to Ukraine and now is heading the Eurasia Center of the Atlantic Council, which is an undesirable organization in Russia. It's a great honor for the organization. Please.
Since 2019.
Well, veterans. Bernard Guetta, member of the European Parliament, and Peter Wagner will join us later from the Commission. Now, I would like to actually start from because since we're talking about the transformation of Russia and the way Russian opposition sees it, and the way the European Union wants to help this process, I would like to start with the beginning, and that is essentially with the state of affairs in Russia. And the poll that was voiced today by my employer, Deutsche Welle, poll by Levada Center, taken just over the last week or something like that, showed us that only 50% only 25% of the Russians actually follow events in Ukraine, I mean the war. They follow the aggression. It means they're interested in this. It does not indicate what they think about it. 25% follow. 25% kind of somewhat are not clear about things. And 50% do not follow this, which is, we all say, a momentous event in Russian history of the last at least 30 years, if not more. So my first question goes to Vladimir MILOV. So before we start discussing the strategy of the opposition the day after Putin is gone, maybe we should look at the society and ask ourselves, is the society interested in what happens the day after, if it can't be bothered with the war. Maybe it can't be bothered with other things too. Vladimir.
Oh, yes, it is interesting. Thank you very much. And I wanted to begin by thanking Andreas and colleagues for organizing this. This is extremely important. And I see a lot of bright and talented people here in this room who will build a future democratic Russia. So it's very important that they get your message of support. They very much need it. So also thank you, Madam Vice President, for your very encouraging speech. Now, opinion polls. Rule number one about Russian opinion polls is that you have to read it all until the end and pay attention to nuance. And in this same Levada poll, there is this graph of dynamics of interest towards the war. So where something really serious actually happens, people really begin paying attention. So last time the huge peak was when Ukrainians liberated Kherson. Before that, with Putin's mobilization announced in September, I'm sure that Ukrainian counteroffensive, which I hope will be successful, will also get a lot of attention. Generally, I wanted to answer the major question which many people are asking in all these sorts of discussions about Russia's democratic future. Is democracy in Russia ever possible? Because many people would argue that Russians are unfit for the Western democratic values and system and so on. Now, I would advise several things to look at. First, the amount of energy and resources for the Kremlin are the most important thing. The amount of energy and resources that the Kremlin and the FSB spends on fighting, spreading the liberal democratic idea in Russia. Now, here's one way to judge that the Kremlin does not think that democracy is not possible. Moreover, they spend most of their resources dedicated to domestic politics in fighting that very specific liberal democratic idea and values. Over, 15 years ago at the elections, which were unfree, unfair, 40 million or something like that leaflets in newspapers were confiscated during the election campaign. From whom? From communists, no. From Zhirinovsky and Rogozin, no. From liberal and democratic parties. Memorial NGO is present here, is keeping a thorough list of political prisoners. If you look at its political part, not speaking about religious political prisoners, who are dominating there among Russian political prisoners? Democrats. Who are dominating on the list of foreign agents, undesired organizations? Also Democrats, you can make a guess. Which means that Kremlin has a very clear understanding that the democratic idea, the democratic future, is his major domestic political competitor. Again, judged by the resources they spend on fighting this idea. And they have a point. Because I traveled across Russia, I've been to 62 regions and literally shook hands of tens of thousands of Russians. They want freedom. They want to have a say. They are pretty much despised with the total lawlessness and they want the rule of law. Of course, this is in a very raw shape because people have been brainwashed for more than 20 years by poisonous Putin's propaganda. Again, when I speak in Western audiences, I often say, look, if you are being put for 22 years, this is how much time have passed since Kremlin took control over the last major independent TV channel, NTV, 22 years. If you are being put into one room with only one television set, which tells you one thing for 22 years, what's the chance that coming out after 22 years you won't be repeating it? So that's an important point. Yes, people are brainwashed, and that's a problem. We will have to cure it. This poisonous propaganda is very infectious. But there is a very raw but strong demand for democratic institutions, for having influence over decision-making, and also on the war. Because, again, right now, with all these difficulties of answering straight questions inside Russia about do you support Vladimir Vladimirovich and his policies, you got to pay attention to a lot of nuances. Many people quote that 70% of Russians support the war. Yeah, but you look to what else they say. Do they really feel pride about what's going on? No. According to the same Levada poll, most emotions are grief, anger, also anger on people's inability to influence things, which means that if they only could, we probably would have had a totally different picture and so on. So when we speak about Russian opinion, again, you really have to pay attention to a lot of nuance. And Madam Vice President recalled experience in Czechoslovakia. So we were actually very proud of you. When you had the Velvet Revolution, it also added a lot of tailwinds to us. So overthrew a communist regime in the Soviet Union 2 years later. We lived in that times when you were forced to read between the lines. And if you read between the lines, you will see a very strong momentum on rejection of what Putin is doing, rejection of aggression, and people who really want Russia to be normal, peaceful, democratic country which is not attacking anyone and obeys the rule of law, internationally and domestically for its citizens. It's a long road. There are many bumps and difficulties ahead, but again, I was a witness of this bottom-up demand from Russian society for normalcy, and believe me, life exists there.
Vladimir, for this powerful introduction. You know what is interesting is you say, well, we'll need to essentially tell these people that have been subjected to propaganda for 22 years, well, we'll have to tell them the truth. Essentially, as someone who, you mentioned the Velvet Revolution, I was very much grown up when 1991 collapse of the communist system happened, and you've grown up too. We remember how it happened. And one of the problems is that, looking back, is that there are very few people who are telling the society how it will develop from then on. And this experiment, to a large extent, failed because there was a very small minority that was trying to lead the majority, and the majority did not follow in the end. So my question goes to Sergey PARKHOMENKO, who is speaking Russian. Aren't we falling into this? What should be done not to fall into this trap of people again saying, oh, it was just a few people that wanted this thing called democracy? How we do not repeat mistakes of the past? Please, the mic is yours. Switch it on.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to participate in this event, which promises to be really a historic one. Thank you very much to our friends from the European Parliament who have managed to take a great effort to gather this distinguished audience, and I'm very happy and honored to address you today. Yes, there are groups of people. There's a big group of people who are busy to do so that the people who think about Russia after Putin, after Putinism, after totalitarianism, after our today's fascism, Russia regime, for this group not to be in a minority, for them not to be destroyed. It is clear it's not only journalists, and I would like to be speaking on their behalf, but not only. I would like to explain to you later why I'm speaking on this behalf, but there's a huge number, and this is not a mistake, a huge number of human rights activists who continue living and fighting for opportunities to continue operating both in Russia and abroad. And here, I would like to remind you, first of all, about yesterday's events. The name of Alexei Navalny was not pronounced here at this meeting, which is totally not fair. Alexei Navalny, who celebrated his birthday yesterday, well, we called his name here. Oh, I'm sorry. Then I missed it. I overlooked it. Yesterday, the world celebrated the action called Free Navalny, and in many cities and towns, including Brussels, people were gathering in order to show the posters with his name and with the ideas because of which he's in this horrible situation for these views to be expressed fully. And we could see the people doing the same inside Russia, and we could see to what extent the response of the authorities was harsh, even to individual, single manifestations in Russia. Every person who protests in Russia today risks immediate detention, arrest, and judgment based on a huge number of allegations and violations, starting from breaking the COVID-19 rules. However, the WHO has already declared that COVID-19 is over, and up to multiple articles in the Criminal Code of Russia adopted recently on discreditation of the army, speculating false information on what is going on in the fields of the special military operation, and these atrocity makers have a huge toolkit to fight against those who are against the Russian totalitarian regime. Among them are free, independent Russian media, those who are heroically continuing operating in Russia, who continue working in the depths of remote areas in Siberia, Zabaikal, and in other areas. These are the areas where a Russian regime excavates hundreds of thousands of people to be at war, hoping that these people won't be able to express their protest, that their voices won't be heard. So these media continue working there, and they tell us how people suffer because of the war, being so far away from the war front. But there are certainly those in large cities in Moscow, and there are lots of free media who left Russia and who continue operating in exile. These are the people who withstand Putin's propaganda around the world, and I would like to stress around the world, because we perfectly understand that Putin's regime today aggressively, intensively, and spending any people and resources tries to keep its influence on the civil society in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, around the world. This becomes gradually a more and more important factor in European life and the democratic life around the world, since this becomes an important factor for elections. We can see that the ideas of supporting the Putin's regime or submerging into and this was a forceful, as they say, responsive regime who was responding to the free world. These ideas exist in the political life of the majority of countries, including democratic nations. We can see that in elections, and we can see that extremist, nationalist, and destructive neo-Nazi forces come to power through elections in many parliaments. Therefore, the work of Russian media outside of Russia becomes important in this regard as well. Russian journalism, free, independent Russian journalism, is not only declared hazardous, harmful, etc., it is criminalized in Russia, just like the life of the civil society. In this context, it's very important to say that a modern journalist is not using a pen and a pencil, but he or she uses modern communications. Russia is the country which has blocked the largest social media like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. Today, they already operate through VPN, and there are others standing in a row, including YouTube and other systems through which Russian journalists continue staying in touch with their audience. And here, I would like to continue the idea first expressed by Dmitry Muratov, the Nobel Prize winner. He was speaking about the global movement of engineers. Indeed, lots of things depend on the technology. Journalists find it very difficult to contact these companies like Google, Apple, YouTube. We do not see them understanding the situation. They say that they are doing business, nothing else. But nevertheless, in their hands, they have colossal opportunities. They can withstand the totalitarian willingness to get Russian media of their audience. And this is not about helping journalists. The country with a crazy dictator at the head who manipulates nuclear weapons should not get global control over the internet. That should be the question. And this threat and fighting it is in the hands of these largest companies who can create tools to avoid blocking, who can create a situation when blocking for the totalitarian regime of Putin would be too risky and expensive. In the pocket of every policeman, civil servant, FSB officer, they have an iPhone or a phone working on the Android OS. This thing should be turn into a brick once the largest communication opportunities are blocked for Google, YouTube, and others. And every civil servant in Russia should be aware that the systems that are critically, vitally important to Russia shall either suffer or die if there is an attempt to technically attack the communication systems. It's very important to remember that, and I would urge our colleagues and friends here in the European Parliament to do that, because it is dependent on the European, British, American politicians. This is the pressure to be exercised on the largest technological companies who should be aware of their role in this process. Thank you.
Since we have the Vice President here, Madam, comment on this is a very important thing. Really, what Sergey said is very, very important.
I already swallowed too much time here by the opening speech, but to react on what you said about the big tech, we are on the case. For years, I was telling the big platforms like Meta, Facebook, Google, Twitter, and others, please be neutral. Do not push your nose into politics. Do not moderate the political debate. We just want you to be neutral, and of course to kill the crime online, which is child pornography, which is hate speech, and so on. The crime which has been defined in the EU law, yeah, and disinformation, which has the potential to incite the violence in real life and so on. For years, I was telling them, be neutral and do this thing. When the invasion started, I had a meeting with all the big ones, and I had to tell them, choose the right side of the history. And they are doing more or less what we agreed on, which is mainly the fact-checking of disinformation. They can do more. I spoke to Google about the ability of accessibility to YouTube in Russia. And we speak about the possibility of better cooperation between the big platforms and the Russian journalists in exile in the EU, so that they can get the way to transfer the content onto the Russian territory. If you have other ideas how the big tech could help, please let us know. I speak on behalf of the Commission. We have everyday dialogue with them. This morning I spoke to all of them again about the code of practice against disinformation. One thing might be of some interest for you, what I heard in Davos this year in winter, that there is a big shift of money for propaganda from the EU back to Russia. It seems to be the case that the brainwashing of Russian people is more costly and more demanding. This is at least how I read it. Yeah. So that's the data I received from. I will not say who told me that. But if you have ideas how we can help through our contact with the big platforms, I am the person to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And what you said actually interestingly proves Vladimir's point about the focus of the Kremlin in the last days. Since we're at it, it's an unexpected development, but still, I'd like to ask John Herbst. I don't know. I know you were part of the American government. You are not anymore. But what do you think about the U.S. View of essentially containing Putin's attempts to isolate Russia from the point of view of information and access to social media even more? Will the U.S. be ready to act?
I was very happy to be with you this morning, but I follow the rules of our chairperson. I will continue in English.
It's very clear that the United States has understood, going back 8 or 9 years, really early into Moscow's war on Ukraine, Putin's war on Ukraine, that Russian disinformation was a very dangerous phenomenon that needed to be addressed. And in fact, I've been at the Atlantic Council for over 9 years, and we did a report called Hiding in Plain Sight, which pointed out that despite what many Western newspapers thought, there was not a civil war going on in Donbass, but a Russian hybrid, somewhat secret war that would not exist without Russian leadership, money, weapons, and information operations. So people understand this is a danger, and significant steps have been taken to deal with it. And there are certainly parts of the world that were very vulnerable to Kremlin disinformation 8, 9 years ago, which are no longer vulnerable. I would point out Georgia as one such place. I would point out most of Ukraine, actually, as another. But this remains a problem, although much less of a problem today after Moscow's big invasion, because, as many speakers have already noted, it was hard for even the most convinced Putin-versteher to argue that Russian troops are not committing war on Ukraine, in fact, massive war crimes. So I am relatively optimistic on this side of the war. In fact, I'm relatively optimistic on many sides of the war, because I think we saw the massive Russian offensive this year fizzle out in Bakhmut, and we see a looming Ukrainian counteroffensive, which, despite timidity in the West in sending weapons, will have certainly a strong measure of success, although how large a measure is unclear. If you don't mind, Konstantin, I'll make just a couple more points.
Yes, please.
All right. I was delighted to hear Mr. Hodorkovsky and Ms. Arnaud talk about the importance of unity in the Russian community worldwide, because that is absolutely the most important thing for any success in this effort. I'm actually a little bit shy speaking here, because this is really not so much a place for Americans or Westerns, it's a place for Russians, because change in Russia will only come at the hands of Russians themselves. By and large, I think the United States has shown over the past 20 years its inability to effect changes within internal structures around the world, in the greater Near East, and it's even harder in Russia. So this is really your work. Someone called this a hall of believers, and I agree. You believe in the chance for change in Russia. You believe in the chance for Russian democracy, which has not thrived historically in Russia. I had many conversations with my friend Vladimir MILOV about his views that there is a Russian democratic tradition. That's true, but the larger narrative has not been of democracy. But I actually think you have a good chance of success, because I don't think Russia can remain a great power unless it adopts democratic practices, gives up its imperial traditions, because the modern world does not work that way. And there are people in Russia who understand that, even people who are currently sitting in the elite, too timid to say anything or do anything, but who recognize, as everyone just about globally recognizes, that Putin's big invasion of Ukraine was a disaster for his regime, and therefore brings the day of the liberation of Russia from that regime closer. But again, that's a Russian project, not an American project. And we will wish you well. We might be able to provide venues for you to talk about this, but this is your work. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. And I would like to, on the strength of your words, to move back to the question of, well, the day after and what needs to be done, and speak to Dmitry, who will also speak in Russian as far as I understand. In the opening session, Mikhail Khodorkovsky said that we should ensure that change in Moscow will be real. It will not be just someone from the regime, but with a different surname that will take place in, well, the Kremlin, whatever, in Moscow, and things will go on as they did or with slight amendments. But if we're talking even about the fall of Putin as a result of Ukraine's victory, how can, well, the opposition, the civic society, the Russians that are not indifferent to the fate of Russia, how can they ensure that it will not happen and that the European Parliament and the European Commission and everyone else will not have to deal with a Mishustin spring or something like that?
Да, спасибо большое. Но я хотел бы также поблагодарить.
Yes, thank you very much, and I would like to appreciate the host and Andreas Kubilius for this meeting, and I will probably have a few messages. Still, I would like, before speaking about the day after, I believe we should get ready for this today, and I believe that our today's meeting is an important element in shaping, let's call it, a coalition of democratic anti-war powers or forces. It was started in Berlin, and it is very important. Well, certainly we are different organizations, but uniting efforts always bring fruit. And it's critically important that this reunion is based on that, what has been mentioned by Mr. Khodorkovsky. I'm not going to reiterate. I remember when I started the election campaign, it was back in 2017, the municipal campaign, we had an internal slogan that the majority are better, that the good people are the vast majority, but bad people are better organized. So we thought that maybe democratic opposition would not bring fruit, but we won. We brought 267 deputies. We united different forces, parties, and we got 10 times more votes than the entire parliamentary opposition. Then we repeated the success in St. Petersburg and in some other cities. But as soon as the so-called parliamentary, yes, of course, fake parliamentary opposition. But once we unite, we have all chances to win. Recall 2019 Moscow, when all oppositional candidates united into coalition. Certainly, we faced troubles and detentions for 30, 40 days in various investigative detention centers, but still it was the response of the authorities because they realized that by uniting opposition can easily win elections. I'm reiterating this because quite often we are asked, who do you represent? There's a war has been going on for a year, and they're likely to vote for some Prigozhin, and the West will have to deal with the regime that will be worse than the Putin's regime. So I would like to say, I can give you 30 names of people, of politicians, public figures, who at the parliamentary elections in 2022 could easily win the elections in single mandate constituencies. This is not the party list. When you win this, you get a majority of votes. So if today we act successfully together here when facing these challenges to stop the war, to have a military defeat of Putin, because this gives chances for political transition in the country, then in the future this coalition or political center will be able to win any elections inside the country, because many of us here are going to get back as soon as the window of opportunities is open. Therefore, establishing and creating this wide coalition is important for us in the future, and for us to get some political actor role, which is very important here in Europe. Another message which is important, well, what are we going to do with Mishustin? Even if there's any breakage in elites, even if a Mishustin comes, this will not be for long. This is possible, and the chances are there are high chances that once elites split, then for some time we will see the representatives of the system getting on top. But the context will be different. They will not have a monopoly. There will be a few different centers that will be fighting between them. But the role of the democratic opposition coalition will be critical, as well as the role of the West, which affects the issues of releasing sanctions, like setting requirements like to remove troops, to stop the war, to pay compensation, to start reforms. Only in this case, sanctions can be removed. And maybe one more important message is as follows. The role of the European Union, the role of the collective West. Because when we say that it all depends on us, but when we look at the history, then we can see that it depends a lot on the collective West and the European Union, because if we want to change anything, well, imposing sanctions policy, I'm not sure it will bring fruit. We can take a look in Germany, 1920s in Europe. We know the consequences, and only understanding that Germany could be reformed only by including it inside your own legal, judicial, political, military structure. The same happened in other countries, Spain, Portugal. Yeah, it was easier, but nevertheless, this democratic transition, this integration into the structures of the European Union brought fruit, and the European Union turned into an important institution that cured the imperial syndrome in these countries. Therefore, there should be a joint roadmap supported by the European Union, and there should be integration of Russia after Putin. And that means that Russia needs not only the values, Russia needs European norms in human rights, the judicial system, economic norms. That's the only way for Russia to be further integrated. At the end, I would like to say that Russia will be a threat until it becomes a part of Europe. Thank you.
I'd like to ask Kirill Rogov from his place, because we don't have enough space for everyone here, to develop this this thought about basically the after, whether it's Mishustin light or not. What, in your view, should be the first steps? And since ending the war, withdrawing Russian troops to 91 borders, reparations, war criminals, war crimes tribunal are absolutely indispensable. How do you think the transition or the democratic forces, how could they support this first very important step and explain it to the Russian public?
Yeah, thank you. I met here the nostalgic culture of deficit, because while I was standing in the line for my coffee, I lost my chair here. So but it doesn't undermine my gratitude to Mr. Kuberev's. No, it's okay. Here
I am leaving.
No,
I have to run away.
I feel very comfortable here. It was just a joke. And I'm very grateful to all organizers of this event, because really, possibly, maybe it will be the starting point for a new format of Russia-European dialogue. But I'm very interesting question you asked me, but I'm going to say a little bit different thing about what I can describe as strategic framework for Russian opposition. And I'll speak Russian. Мне кажется чрезвычайно важным.
I think it's greatly important to understand what can be a strategic frame for what we can call the Russian opposition and its place, without exaggerating it and underestimating it. During previous 20 years, two processes were underway in Russia, which I keep repeating. The trend towards autocracy from the top, and the process of social modernization from the bottom. And the war, the current war, is a kind of an open conflict between these two diverging trajectories. We must remember it, and we should not think in terms of Putin determinism, that everything was proceeding towards this, that this was being prepared, and we have nothing but dictatorship. Sorry, it's bullshit. It was not the case. The modernization potential that we have in Russia is significant. Of course, it will be strongly undermined by this dictatorship, which is established on the background of the war. But this damage will not be deadly. It will last for 5 to 10 years, and this potential for modernization which exists in Russia, had we have not so sustainable dictatorial institutions, and had we have this free elections, the European and pro-liberal group of the society can easily get 20 or 25%. They can get more in some coalitions, but this coalition would be weak and later they would collapse. Please speak to the microphone. That's a lot. It's not enough to create an established democracy in a country, but this is significant counterweight and stabilizer which can keep the regime from what has happened to it recently, from some ruptures and from choosing the wrong path towards dictatorship and aggression. That would be enough, and this is an important resource. Today we also have a unique situation when we, as a significant part of Russian civil society activism, independent journalism and political opponents are beyond the reach of law enforcement, and also they have the ways to access audience in Russia which any diasporas and never opposition abroad had. This is a completely unique situation. They will try to block it, but it will take much time. But so far this access exists, and so far it works. This is the very important resource too. The third important point, when we think what will be happening, there are two concepts. One concept is that we need a full defeat of Putin's Russia, the military defeat, and after this defeat, some window of opportunity will open. But the other concept, I think, is more realistic. I think that full military defeat of Russia is not very realistic, and it would also be quite dangerous, because it will create a window for unmanaged escalation and large problems. The most favorable is a scenario within which partial military defeat of Russian army would result in weakening the regime, growing dissatisfaction with the regime, and this is how we would go to some different situation. If we take this viewpoint, if this is seen as the optimal scenario, it puts a large problem in front of us for a possible Russian opposition. The Russian opposition abroad can exist in two formats: symbolic or operational. What is the symbolic format? This is when we have our opposition abroad, which represents some perfect Russia of the future, which will come in some 50 years. It is fully engaged in LGBTQ issues. It fully meets the Western expectations from the future liberal Russia, but in fact it loses an opportunity to talk to Russia of today. And in this conversation, this opposition will not be very functional, it will not be very influential. It would get capital in the West, but it would lose its capital in Russia. Or the opposition would choose an operational strategy, aiming at addressing their audience in Russia, which is kept hostage, and also simultaneously a collaborator of evil, but potentially they are not happy with this position. And this would be a different conversation. This would demand a different language, a different comprehension. It would demand hard talks between radical groups of the opposition and this moderate, pragmatic part of the opposition. It would demand agreements in advance about some cohabitation and feeling as single unit, and this could be effective. Another thing to keep in mind: when Putin's army is defeated and Putin's legitimacy will be weakened, I'm about to end, last minute. The power will not go automatically to democratic actors. No, this is when we will see the fight between radical revanchists like Prigozhin. This is why it's so important that we have the voice of liberal opposition in place, because these will be the two alternatives offering themselves to replace the Putinism which will be about to leave. So the alternative is not about whether power will come to us or we will have to fight for it. No, to get into the power in the future, to get into pro-Putin coalition, we will need the voice which will have to oppose the voice of radical revanchists. Well, the last thing I want to say, because I'm afraid of Kostya, if this Russian opposition establishes itself, their central problem will be the problem of leadership. The leadership in systematic, institutional meaning. In Russia, like in other post-Soviet countries, we are bad in creating parties, and we don't know the party culture. So this interconnection between the activists and the top representatives will be the stumbling block. So it's not about choosing, electing the people who will have to represent the opposition and speak on its behalf. It's about preserving this restricting frame and their dependence from the community of activists. Sorry, we have other speakers. Okay, I'm done. I'm sorry. I have a follow-up question.
Which was mentioned a few times here, says that those who sign agree that Russia should return to 1990. I'm going back to the war, which is an essential fact here. Russia should go back to 91 borders, criminals should be punished, reparations should be paid. So what essentially you say, this should not be on the agenda?
On which agenda?
On the agenda of the opposition. So opposition should at least play it down. So this declaration was wrong. Because what I infer from what you say is that people will not like it. Because of that, we shouldn't talk about it. That's how I read it. If I read it wrong, just tell me.
I think that in opposition, я думаю, что в оппозиции, как я сказал, будет радикально.
I think we'll have different groups in the opposition. There will be very radical groups and there will be moderate groups. And we have to understand their potential conflict can undermine the whole effort. And this conflict will be permanently stimulated, and we have to bear it in mind that we have two ways. You can be fully compliant with European attitudes and Ukrainian attitudes in what they see as the solution. Okay, it's right, but then you will have less influence in Russia towards undecided people in Russia, or vice versa.
Vladimir?
Yeah, I think I've heard too much from the status quo party. In a couple of weeks, I'm turning 51 years old. And I'm always hearing from analysts, the media, that it's going to be status quo, status quo, status quo. It's going to be very difficult too, very difficult too. The thing is that during my lifetime, life in Soviet Union and then Russia was changing like a roller coaster. It was anything but status quo, meaning that the system that consecutive totalitarian governments were trying to build was absolutely non-sustainable, was absolutely based neither on a viable economic model, not actually on, I know a lot of pundits would interpret this, opinion polls like the crystal ball of what Russian people really think. Now, I know what Russian people really think, and they don't like this model. I think every Western commentator knows the word Khabarovsk. That Khabarovsk is the answer to Mishustin and Prigozhin. Konstantin, back to your questions. So when a region was liberated from a political monopoly of United Russia ruling party, it all went to defend the imprisoned governor who actually liberated them, regardless of their views and so on. So basically, Khabarovsk would tell you that people in Russia want freedom. So I think there are examples like South Korea after Chonduhuan, or Romania, EU member state, after Ceausescu, when there was some sort of similar government like Mishustin trying to hold on to power. What prevented this and led to democratization was a serious bottom-up movement. We're working on it, and we really have significant following well beyond the 20-25%, which Kirill was speaking about. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible. So what I wanted to do is encourage enthusiasm in many of the very decent and talented Russians here. It's not guaranteed, might not happen, but we can make it happen, so let's try.
Vladimir, спасибо, thanks a million. I wanted to ask Monsieur Guetta to comment first on what is expected in the EU, what you personally expect as an MEP from the Russian opposition with regard to Ukraine and the war. And secondly, I do know that you have ideas about what could have been done. So the floor is yours.
Well, I expect the Russian opposition to do a very simple and obvious thing, to replace Mr. Putin's regime. There is an emergency for that, an emergency for Ukraine, obviously, but an emergency also for Russia, because Mr. Putin, in the coming months, at least in the coming year, will also destroy Russia by his aggression against Ukraine. Why? Because the Russian Federation will break down if this war lasts for too many months. And so I would like, if you allow me to do that, I would like to put on the table 3 ideas for the opposition. 3 ideas to organize successfully a change of this regime. The first idea would be to try to avoid a civil war and precisely a new smutное время, un nouveau temps des troubles, a new time of the trouble. And for that, you will need, it's unpleasant, I'm sorry, but I will tell you, you will need to find some kind of arrangement with the most clear-headed individuals from the establishment. I mean technocrats, civil servants, managers of the industry, and yes, also some Siloviki and oligarchs. I know it's unpleasant, but you have to find the people who already understood that Mr. Putin is leading the country to a complete disaster, who are wishing to avoid a breaking down of the Federation, and who could be ready to facilitate the eviction and the condemnation of Putin for his crime against Ukraine, Russia, and humanity. It's not a very nice prospect, I know again, but let's reflect on the two most successful transitions of the recent decades, I mean Spain and Poland. To prevent a new civil war, the Spanish Democrats in the 70s needed to strike a deal with the less unpalatable figures, technocrats mainly, of the fascist regime. They had to accept a few years of transition between fascism and democracy. And this deal was so successful that my friend Adam Mirtnik, returning from Madrid, borrowed this idea of self-limiting revolution, a concept almost immediately understood and accepted by his countrymen. Using this moderation, Poland became a democracy almost 6 months before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So let's remember the example given by Spain and Poland. Second point, you should at the same time engage in a dialogue with Ukraine and the European Union on the condition for a lasting peace on the continent. It is vital that you do so, as you will need the support of the EU as soon as you get in charge, maybe in 1, 2 or 3 years, or even sooner. We, the European Parliament, made the first step more than a year ago with the address to the Russian people, signed by the leaders of the political group of this Parliament and by myself. But we did not get a reply. We did not get a reply until now. Maybe it is the time for you to respond, not only out of politeness, of course, but because a dialogue with the European Parliament would and could enhance your credibility in your own country. And third, you got to be able to write a common program for you citizens, not for the European Union, not for Ukraine, not to excuse yourself for the crime of Mr. Putin, but to seduce and to mobilize your countrymen. This is what the National Council of the French Resistance made during the occupation. They published a program very simple, with very simple ideas, not exactly bread and peace, chlieb i mir, not only that, a little bit more sophisticated, of course, but nevertheless simple, clear and understandable for the people of France at that time. For this program, you should remember at least one point. In the 1990s, it was the time of the shock therapy. We all know what was, politically speaking, the result of the shock therapy. Now, everywhere, not only in Europe, but also in the US, look at the economic program of Mr. Biden. Chicago boys are out and Keynes is back. And so you will have to propose some kind of balance between the capital and the labor, between some kind of social protection and certainly investment in public services, health, transportation, and education, because this is what you people, as every people, expect now. Two more lines. Ukraine will defeat Putin. You will overcome his regime. You will create a democratic Russia, a non-imperial one. And with this Russia, we will build, we, the European Union, a continent of peace and freedom. Thank you.
John, a quick intervention, please. And if you can, please comment, that's important, on this idea of the Russian opposition establishing
That's exactly
a dialogue
what
with
I comment on.
Please.
Look, it's again for the Russian opposition to decide its own positions. I would hope they would adopt the wisdom of Kluchevsky, who wrote something like, when the Kremlin marches, the Russian people suffer. And if you understand that, you understand that if you're going to play to, say, the more conservative elements of Russian society and say, well, you know, maybe we're not going to make any commitments on Ukraine's territorial integrity, you will ensure the maintenance of tough Western policies in terms of arming Ukraine, in terms of beefing up NATO, in terms of sanctions on Russia. I think that's a serious mistake. But again, Russian opposition has to determine its own position. Thanks.
Thanks a million, John. And I would like to ask Peter Wagner, who insists on speaking from his desk, and who represents the Commission here when Madam Jourova left. Look, you heard this discussion. And of course, it is for the Russian people, for the Russian opposition to decide on strategy and tactics. But in terms of support, what can realistically the EU do? And what do you think are the expectations here as to what the Russian opposition could produce? Because that is politics and that is a quid pro quo too, not only talking about ideas. Please.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, I decided to stay here partly for reasons of solidarity, even if I didn't have coffee. And secondly, I would further unravel gender balance up there.
Lift your mic a little bit.
If I would come up. Yeah. Now, I'll be as loud as possible. And I think I can give you a part of the answer already by telling you first what we are doing. Because that means within the European Commission, we are the service that is reporting to the High Representative and Vice President, Mr. Borrell. And we are providing foreign policy instruments quickly. And that is, of course, what we had to do when developments in Russia intensified and accelerated early last year. But having said this, we have been present in support of civil society and media already before last February. That's very important. So very briefly, we do that globally. And we are, to jump already to one conclusion, of course, at the moment, inter alia, assessing what can we do substance-wise, because Russia is a huge country, and even if some people say there's not enough opposition, there's still many people, and there's still a lot of initiatives, activities, etc., that have to be or could be supported. And comparing that with many of the smaller countries globally that we are dealing with is a challenge in itself, to just make sure that there are enough resources available. Now, Vice President Jourova has set out the general political reasoning behind what we do, and we are really there now to put that into motion. And into motion means that immediately as of February, when first journalists were in accelerated manner and civil society activists leaving the country, we were putting into place first elements of core support. And that's an important one, we started making platforms available, supporting the people in reaching out to all kinds of counterparts on the Western side. Because it is, of course, important. It's not only Brussels. There are many member states that are trying to support, and there is where we're trying to put actors in contact with each other. So that really the civil society, democratic representatives of Russia, well, exiled or whatever then there is as a preferred world, can reach out to the Western interlocutors. Secondly, we've been trying with a number of projects to support visibility of what is going on, because you made the point. It's also important that the wider audience understand what is happening, what is the recognition of the different efforts that are going on. We do that notably through, as I said, what we call people-to-people contracts. So we're really trying to have a number of formats where we are trying to put people in contact with each other. By the way, that does not only mean people from Russia with people from Western Europe, that also means people who left Russia to put them into contact with each other, and to every now and then create platforms that there can be structured exchanges between these different actors, where I think there is definitely still scope for better coordination and alignment. What we are running is quite a number of schemes to support independent Russian journalism. That includes resident schemes from here, but also resident schemes with major European outlets that cooperate, and to also see where we can technically support the continuous access of journalists back home. Another part of the pillar, another pillar of what we're doing is to also provide this kind of exchange platforms and allow, on the one hand, to coordinate internally and then to reach out jointly in a coordinated as possible manner, also for groups like scholars, educators, and scientists, because it's a very important and very often not that loudly heard group, and therefore we also invested a bit there. Another pillar where we are looking at is young actors. There are some very young faces. There are people who have much less experience in dealing with the political space and in moving the political space, and we're trying to work with them. And notably there, it is where we have a quite wide range of activities where we are supporting people. That can be dissident movements, anti-war, gender equality, environmental protection groups play quite a role, LGBTI+ groups. There's a lot of groups that we are supporting and where we try to make platforms, but also then means to survive here in the West available. For us, it's also very important, and you saw this morning also my colleague Michael Siebert from the diplomatic branch, that we are trying to also have contacts institutionally, because for us, there are two dimensions. We, of course, always, whatever we do, have resource constraints, but the more important it is that we really understand what is it of the different activities that is perceived as being the most important and useful, where so far the community has been struggling a bit with the formulation, and the same also with the way forward. I think we are ready to continue this support and to prepare for a day after and to look at what is needed then. But we would also really need there some ideas, some aligned ideas. Diversity is an important part, but on the other hand, the kind of consolidated demand side would help us very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Milin. The Russian participants here, Vladimir, Sergey, Kirill, and Dmitry, to very briefly, literally 1 minute, to formulate 3 points that could round up our discussion today. And these are 3 very simple answers to 3 questions. A, what should Russian opposition do with regard to Ukraine? Just step 1. 2, what should Russian opposition firstly do about impacting the society? What is the main message that should be delivered to the Russian society? And number 3, what should be the message, if you wish, to the outside world about the future Russia that will be built? I know that Dmitry answered this question to some extent, but please, let's start from Vladimir, and then Sergey, then Kirill, and then you. Very briefly. I have this, by the way. No one saw it. I didn't need it.
Talk to the Russian people. That's the most, I think it fits into all 3 of your questions, Kostya. That's the most important thing. It is painfully slow and difficult, but people are getting convinced. If you look at the dynamics in the same polls, they are shifting our way, not Putin's way. So it's possible. And there are people in Russia who want to hear the answers, want to hear about a better future, and want to live in peace with Ukraine. Russians, great majority of Russians have nothing against Ukraine. Before the war, super majority supported territorial integrity of Ukraine inside Russia, right before the war began, which tells you what they really think. So talking to people is the most important thing today. We can change Russia if we convince the majority of the country to shift on our side, and that is possible.
Thank you for your brevity. Sergey.
Я не уверен, что я смогу вот так построить свой ответ по этим.
I don't know if I will be able to construct my answer according to your 3 points, but I would like to express one common consideration. And the point is that the further the war goes, the more clear it is that the Russian opposition and Russian human rights defenders and Russian journalists, Russian civil society activists, don't have any tasks separated from this war. They don't have any tasks isolated from this war. So it's not only about helping some people living in Russia or Russian people living beyond the country. Probably I should say help Russian journalists. Probably I should say help Russian human rights defenders. Help them. Help them. No, my point is help yourselves, because these tasks are an organic part of this war. This is what I want to reiterate from my first statement. It's not about preserving access to YouTube for Russian journalists. It's about preventing the totalitarian Putin state access to nuclear weapons and control over internet. That's your task, and journalists are just random beneficiaries of this process. So you have common tasks in this war. Ukraine must win and Putin must lose. And on the ruins of this war there is some new Russia which has to be created. And this is how we can go about any problem and any difficulty that people in Russia are facing, or who work beyond Russia and work for Russia.
Thank you very much, Kirill. What opposition can say to Ukraine, Russia, and the world? I fully agree with Vladimir that the key thing to be said by the opposition is to address the population of Russia and to try to weaken Putin, therefore to make the fair ending of this war closer. The Russian opposition could say to Europe that Russia has always been Eurasia, the country that is half seated in Europe, and historically and culturally it is half Europe. Thank you, Dmitry. Well, probably I will have to reiterate. The first question was, what should we do? Or
Russian
Все,
people,
понял.
the West.
Потому что ты изначально сказал про то, что делает оппозиция. Ну, хорошо.
Okay. It seems to me that the key message for Ukraine is in this Berlin Declaration. And however, I do know that a few interventions were like 2 by 2 equals 4, but this requires collecting votes. But this is a strong message. And after signing this declaration, the Ukrainian establishment and many people, my subscribers and my supporters, could see that, and they were inspired. So what should be said to Russia? I believe we should say that together. We should break this narrative coming from the Putin's propaganda. You see, they say that the West, all of them hate us, Russians, our country. I believe the message should be the opposite. The key enemy is not Russia, not the Russian society, but the Russian criminal terrorist regime. I believe this message should be promoted by all means. It's extremely important. And I would like to add some positive sentiment here. This is what has been mentioned by Mr. Rogov in the previous discussion. When we speak about the Berlin Declaration, then you are losing now. Yes, at the elections, it would be difficult today following this position. But I would like to say that when I was one of the 4 deputies who was against the annexation of the Crimea, it hurt me during the elections in 2016 by 10%. We lost about 10% because of that. But 6 years after, the situation changed. The context was different, the social opinion was different, and this was not affecting it, because when answering the question why you voted, because your pension age got higher, because Russia made annexation of the Crimea. Therefore, when there is a window of opportunities, the ideas of the Berlin Declaration will not be undermining our electoral opportunities, and they will not be contradicting the opinion of the society. Thank you.
It was timely. Not everyone was immersed in smartphones. So, before we go for the sandwiches that were very courteously offered to us by the European taxpayer, not by the European Parliament, the European taxpayer, I would like you all to thank heartily the participants of this discussion. Please.
I would like to make